I knew that danger lay ahead, of course, but I didn't expect to meet it in our own shire. Can a hobbit walk from the water to the river in peace? But it is not your own shire, said Gildor. Others dwelt here before hobbits were, and others will dwell here again when hobbits are no more. The wide world is all about you. You can fence yourselves in, but you cannot forever fence it out.
Welcome to the Wayward Wizards podcast. I'm Zach.
And I'm Logan.
And this week we are reading chapter 3 of book 1 of the Fellowship of the Ring. 3 is company. So, Logan, what goes down this week? What happens?
Frodo and his friends and relatives make plans to leave Bag End, though not in a rush.
They take their time.
Yeah. They finally do set off, and once they're on the road, they have some encounters with Black Riders, which really ups the stakes in a big way. And then of course there's a encounter with elves. It's everything Sam dreamed of.
Sam's greatest dreams come true.
Happening right here in the Shire, which is pretty fascinating. So we get a little sense of what's going on in the world beyond the confines of this, little emerald place.
Right. But that's right. And we get a little wizard disappearing action, which is definitely a theme in
yeah, definitely
in all of Tolkien. Gandalf just like disappearing into thin air.
No one knows where he is.
Nobody knows where he is, and the hobbits have to kind of fend for themselves out in this dangerous path, even though they don't really know what they've gotten themselves into yet fully, do they?
No, they don't.
So yeah, we start out, Gandalf has just said, like, you have to get out of the Shire, and Frodo's like planning on doing it with Sam. And if this was a modern novel, they would have left that night. Yeah. But they take several weeks to plan all the logistics.
Gandalf says you ought to go quietly and you ought to go soon. And then 2 or 3 weeks passed.
Yeah.
And he's made no sign of being ready to go.
No, and Frodo's basically like, I can't just like go off like Bilbo did with Flash.
Right.
And Gandalf is like, I said soon, not instantly.
Yeah.
But right. I think that this like really speaks to Tolkien's practicality. Right. Like he realizes that like if Frodo were just to up and leave Bag End, that would cause a huge stir.
Right.
And you can't actually just pick up and leave. Like you have to think through the logistics of where you're going to go. And it does kind of create a slower pace, but Frodo has to lay out all these plans. He has to sell Bag End. He has to buy a new house so that people don't think that he's just going off into the blue like Bilbo did. And he's got to move all of his stuff. Like nobody likes to think about the logistics of moving your house, but
no,
anybody who's ever moved knows you have more stuff than you ever thought until you start putting it in boxes.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, Tolkien, it's never just like you snap your fingers and you're there. He always thinks it through, like, okay, how long would it take to get the preparations? How long would it take to walk to a certain place? And that's one thing that's really consistent in the book is that nobody ever just shows up in a place faster than they would have been capable of getting there. Yeah. And he's thought through all the logistics of travel, how long it would take someone to get to a place. And then he makes sure that it aligns with how he described their departure date, so that it aligns with not only the calendar, which he kept really intense notes about the movement of every character and where they were on certain dates, but also, what phase of the moon they would see, like when they're walking at night, when he describes the stars, he makes sure that the stars align with the time of year and, where they would see. So that attention to detail is, I think, what people love about Tolkien, but also what is one of the biggest stumbling blocks of people getting really into Tolkien.
Yeah. There's a sort of meme around Star Trek and Star Wars fandom that whenever somebody asks how fast a certain ship is, the answer is that the ship goes as fast as the plot needs it to, like it travels at the speed of plot, and that's not really the case here. I think that he's thought it through in a way that's more rich and interesting than sort of your typical fantasy novel.
Yeah,
Um,
and he was from a different time. Like he was raised in a time really before the automobile
yeah.
was available to everyone. He and his family owned an automobile, but he was notoriously bad at driving it. Like he would crash it all the time and have to have people come and like pull him out of ditches.
That's
Um,
funny.
and so he had like a real hatred of like the motorization of Europe. But
Hmm.
he was from a time when if you wanted to get somewhere, you had to walk
Right.
and or take a horse, but most people would just walk. And he went on a couple of long walking tours like in the Alps. And of
Mm.
course he fought in World War I and had to do a lot of marches with people. And so it's something that he had like a real intuition of like, okay, you are not going to walk with a pack
Yeah. How many
more
miles
than
can you
20 miles. Like 20
exactly?
miles is like an upper limit of
Yeah,
how far you could walk in a day.
absolutely.
Um, and the one exception being, and we'll get to this in the Two Towers, in about 60 years, but when the when Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas run after the Uruk-hai, they run at this incredible pace, and the Rohirrim, they say like, I name you Wingfoot. Like how could you possibly have gotten from there to here
Yeah.
that quickly? But when you look at the terrain that they crossed and the amount of miles that they covered, it's not an impossible
Hmm.
feat. So even the like really amazing distances that people are able to cover are still within the realm of what's physically possible. So
Right.
I think that's something that's really special about Tolkien, and it really adds to the sense of this being a real lived-in world of people with real bodies.
Hmm.
And even though the pace might not be quite as cinematic as like what we're used to in our media, especially fantasy media,
Yeah.
they don't move at the speed of plot. They move at a reasonable, like, possible pace.
It's really based on what a human being is capable of in a way. Um,
Yeah.
even if some of the feats are superhuman, you know, there's an explanation. Like Aragorn can run that far because he's Aragorn, right? Like,
Yeah.
and
He's just really fit.
an elf can run that far because he's an elf, right? And
Right.
um, yeah. So yeah, the idea that Merry and Pippin and Frodo and Sam do have to take time to think through how much food do we need, how much do we need on our packs, what are we sending ahead of us, to this new property, is all. Um, it's not just background detail; it's sort of practical. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. It's the type of thing that Tolkien, this is how his brain worked. He was always doing math in his head. And I
Yeah.
think that really adds to the experience for us because it feels real.
Right. Yep.
But yeah, so the hobbits, they make all the preparations, and kind of just out of nowhere, Gandalf, he's like, I got to go to the border and get some news. I heard a piece of news that was concerning to me, but we don't ever get an answer to what that news is or who he got it from.
Yeah. Do
Um,
you think that's Black Rider related? Has
I
he
don't
heard?
know.
Has he heard a rumor?
I don't know. I searched high and low. Maybe a listener who is like even nerdier than us can tell us if there's a direct answer to what news did Gandalf get and from whom.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's ever answered in the text. I think he's gotten news from someone, whether it's Aragorn or another ranger,
Right.
that there's something concerning going on. I think, if you look at the timeline of what's going on, this is around the time that the wars in Gondor are starting to happen when
Mhm.
Osgiliath is lost outside of Minas Tirith. And so it might be about the kind of the movement of troops out of Mordor that is concerning to him. It might be that he's caught wind of the Black Riders, but then that begs the question: if he knows the Black Riders are like in the area, why would he leave Frodo to,
Yeah, that's a good question.
fend for himself?
Right.
So I don't think it's ever directly answered, and I don't think we ever really can know. But Gandalf leaves, and of course we'll find out in the Council of Elrond chapter that this is when he interacts with Sauron and gets imprisoned by Sauron,
Right.
which is why he's not able to come back. But they wait for him as long as they can, essentially. But they had planned on leaving after Frodo and Bilbo's birthday.
Yeah.
And so they just go ahead with their plans, and they essentially say, like, we can't wait for Gandalf any longer. We're just going to strike off on our own, and he can meet us in Buckland, at the new house, and he'll probably beat us there anyway, because we're going to take a long road to get there.
Yeah. So then the news reaches the rest of the Shire through Hobbit gossip, basically.
Oh yeah, from
Summer's
the
evening,
Ivy
an
Bush.
astonishing piece of news reached the Ivy Bush and Green Dragon. Giants and other portents on the borders of the Shire were forgotten for more important matters. Mr. Frodo was selling Bag End. Indeed, he had already sold it to the Sackville Bagginses. And so we get some details about the SBs, which is
those SBs. I love it. The SBs.
Yeah. It sounds like a swear word,
It does. It sounds like a curse. But yeah, it's funny. Yeah, the Hobbit gossip train is alive and well. Word travels really fast in Hobbiton about the doings of Frodo and his friends.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that we get a couple of lesser known hobbits introduced into the story. We got Merry and Pippin, of course, who we know well. We got Sam, but then we also get Falco, who I don't think really does anything.
Falco?
I don't think he gets a single line.
I missed that. It's so funny how he names background characters. Just like,
yeah, they don't get any dialogue and they don't really do anything to expand the plot. But it says some of Frodo's friends came to stay and help him with the packing. There was Fredegar Bolger, also known as Fatty. Tolkien loved a good fat joke. And then Falco Boffin.
Falco Boffin, sure.
And of course his special friends, Pippin Took and Merry Brandenburg.
Special friends.
Between them, they turned the whole place upside down.
Yeah.
So they pack up Bag End, and they have a little farewell party.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think I think this is so funny. I mean, they drink all the last of the wine.
Yeah.
So that Lobelia doesn't get a drop of it. And they leave her the dirty dishes, which I think is such a hilarious slight.
It's such a middle finger to Lobelia.
Yeah, the USB.
Yeah. Oh man.
It says, after lunch, the Sackville Bagginses and Lobelia and her sandy-haired son Lotho turned up, much to Frodo's annoyance. Ours at last, said Lobelia as she stepped inside. It was not polite, nor strictly true, for the sale of Bag End did not take effect until midnight. But Lobelia can perhaps be forgiven. She had been obliged to wait about 77 years longer for Bag End than she had once hoped, and she was now 100 years old.
That's funny. Ours at last. What a weird thing to say.
Ours at last. Yeah, what a jerk. But yeah, I mean, we also find out that her husband died.
Yeah.
At a disappointing age of, what was it, 102?
Something like that, yeah.
And then we get introduced to her son, who is confusingly also named Lotho.
Right, that is confusing.
So that's a different Lotho, and he'll of course make his appearance at the very end of the story as well. And in the ultimate British insult, Frodo did not offer her any tea.
Hmm. Yeah, we probably miss that as Americans, a little bit, like how much that sort of breaks the conventions that are, sort of expected.
Yeah,
Um,
like
but
no tea for you.
Frodo just has no time for these people.
No. Our last meal at Bag End, said Frodo, pushing back his chair. They left the washing for Lobelia.
And
So
then
not
they,
only did he not offer her tea, he left her the dirty dishes in the sink,
yeah,
which I
and
think,
they go straight from dinner to putting their packs on.
yeah,
Pippin went for a last stroll in the garden. Sam disappeared, and interestingly, we do get right here at the really at the front of the chapter, we get a little gesture toward somebody looking for Mr. Baggins, which
yeah,
could be Frodo, but obviously could be Bilbo also. And
yeah. Dare we say he's sniffing around?
yeah, sniffing around, and the gaffer stands right up to this person, even as terrifying as it must have been.
Yeah,
Um, and it's all I like that it's all sort of his dismissal of this character is kind of couched in Hobbit, um, um,
ignorance.
well, yeah, ignorance, but it's also couched in like there's a certain way that we do things around here, and talking about our neighbors is not one of them. So why don't you mind your own business, kind of thing,
Yeah, yeah. Get out of here,
Uh,
you big person. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
right. And I, I, there's a comment here about um, he's moved away to Buckleberry or some such place. Like it's just nonsense to the gaffer. Like why would you move? Why would you move over there? I don't know where he's going. Why would I want to know? I don't want to know more about it than I have to know. And he literally doesn't. And so, yeah, I love that he kind of has this false courage because it's based on all this hobbitness, Um, but
Yeah, he's like he's moving off across the water to some such place. I don't know why you would ever go to such a,
don't ask me because
ridiculous.
I don't. Yeah, I've never been there.
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
so.
There's this, there's this sense. And I don't know if we've talked about this really with the hobbits, but they have like this like jingoism about them.
Yeah,
You
they
know,
do.
even like someone who lives like a couple towns over is, they call them outlandish or an outsider.
Yeah, right.
And there's this kind of like dismissal of people who live in Buckland because they bother with
Boats.
boats. Yeah, there's this like hobbit fear of water,
It's
which
just
which is
like
really really interesting.
it's like nonsense. Like the idea that you would get on a boat is like, you know,
What a
it's
ridiculous thing. Which we know that's how Frodo's parents met their untimely
yeah,
ends.
how they
So
died, right.
it's not completely unfounded. But I think
Right.
it's interesting when Bilbo first goes off and we see the kind of the foundation of the Mad Baggins
Mhm.
myth. They blame Gandalf. One, they're like, clearly this wizard has something to do with this
Mhm.
tomfoolery, and they're like, and he's probably dead. He probably fell into a lake or a river somewhere, and he'd probably drowned.
Yeah,
But yeah, there's
right.
this like distrust of any body of water and boats, and uh, distrust of anybody who lives outside the borders of their
Yeah.
little town.
And even Frodo, I think we missed this in the last chapter, but he says, maybe I'll cross that river someday, but not yet.
Yeah,
And so even the crossing of water is sort of seen as a big
yeah, it's
deal.
a big deal. Big
That's a
deal.
that's a natural boundary that is it's psychologically meaningful for people in the Shire for sure.
But yeah, the hobbits, they decide that they can't wait for Gandalf any longer. Um, Frodo says it's going to be a fine night. That's good for a beginning. I
Mm.
feel like walking. I can't bear any more hanging about. I'm going to start, and Gandalf must follow me. And that's where we get this launching off point, starting right from the beginning with this very eerie encounter with what we find out later is a black rider, But yeah, like you said, Handfast is like unbothered by this person. He's more annoyed that someone's like rooting around his friend's business
Yeah.
than anything. But he's not afraid of these Black Riders.
Right.
Um, and I think that's one thing that I wanted to talk about is that we have this image of the Black Riders as being these like physically intimidating forces,
Yeah.
but especially in this part of the story, they're not.
Mm-hmm.
Their power is not a physical intimidation power. It's that they're terrifying. These
Yeah.
are essentially ghosts.
Yeah.
They are.
The idea of a wraith, I think, is really helpful. Um, like, like, what does a wraith do? A wraith doesn't necessarily carry around a sword and threaten you physically. It's something that is more terrifying because it represents the unknown or,
Yeah,
some kind of ignorance or darkness.
yeah. It
That you
like kind
can't
of
see into.
it zaps your courage,
Right.
and it's fearful, but uh, it's not something that's just going to like crush you physically.
Right.
And when we like get to their encounters on the road, we can kind of look at that a little bit more. But
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important, like the vision of the Nazgul that we get later in the book, those are different Nazgul than what we have now.
Mm.
Those Nazgul are one, they're closer to Sauron physically.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
they draw power from Sauron's power, and that gives them this like kind of more physical presence, this
Mm-hmm.
terrifying physical presence where they're riding on winged, mounts, and they're swinging around big maces and
Mm-hmm.
holding flaming swords and things like that. Right now, it's much more subtle. They're away from their center of power. They're not physically intimidating, but the hobbits are like kind of like uniquely suited to stand up to them, partly because of just they don't know who they are,
Right.
and so they don't know to be afraid of them, but also just because of they're just made of sturdy stuff. They're not easily intimidated.
Yeah.
They're you know they don't bother with people like sniffing around their business.
Right.
And so yeah, it's kind of funny to think like the same creature that like faces down Gandalf at the gates of Minas Tirith and is this like extreme danger,
Yeah.
and takes Gandalf like takes like all of Gandalf's power just to face him.
Hey.
This old little hobbit grandpa,
Yeah.
the gaffer just sizes him up and says, "Yeah, get along.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be bothered with you."
It's funny, like believing something is foolishness, sort of like, yeah, it's sort of like guards you against the power of the thing.
Yeah,
Like,
like,
what
yeah, I'm
is
not going to be
this?
intimidated by you.
I have no idea what this is, and so it's probably some foolishness from Buckland, and right, and so or wherever, like somewhere even worse than that, right? And so you can kind of turn a blind eye, or there's some, like, they're immune to the fear that these wraiths would normally put into your heart, because they just don't accept that it's something that should be feared.
Yeah,
um and yeah, that's sort of instructive. I think there are certain ways in which, you know if we go into something with too much knowledge, we kind of suck ourselves out or something like that. But if you kind of
yeah.
just show up and wing it, sometimes, like, you're better off. At least that's what I tell myself. That's what I tell
Just
myself.
laugh at the things that scare you.
Yeah.
Just like I refuse to be afraid of you. Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, the hobbits, they pack up their gear, they hand off the keys to Lobelia, leave her the dirty dishes, and Mary goes off with a cart full of Frodo's stuff
Yeah, the stuff he wants to keep. Right.
and the stuff that wasn't included in the sale.
Mhm.
Sam was off saying goodbye to the beer barrels
Oh, that's right.
of
Yeah. That's
Bag
where
End.
he
He's like,
disappeared to.
wiping his mouth, after saying goodbye to the beer barrels. And he's like, yeah, I'm set for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And, we get like a little bit of like great Hobbit banter where, uh, Frodo's essentially like, yeah, I think you gave me all the heaviest stuff here.
Yeah.
And it says that he like looks at himself in the mirror before he leaves and realizes that he's like a little flabby.
Right.
And so this walk is probably going to do him some good.
Yeah, get himself into shape before he has to leave, the Shire.
Do a bit of training, I think is what he says.
Right.
And, Sam puts on a stupid hat and they get going. But I love Sam's response when Frodo says, I'm sure you've given me all the heaviest stuff. I pity snails and all that carry their homes on their backs. And Sam, just full of desire to please, he says, I can take a lot more yet, sir.
Yeah. My pack is quite light. Stoutly and untruthfully.
And Pippin says, like, hey, yeah, shut up, kid. We know you're carrying more than the rest of us. Let's get going. Frodo needs to carry his weight. Let's get moving. And they start off in the dark.
Yeah. Taking the same path, although they didn't know it, that Bilbo took.
Yeah, and there's lots of parallels here. Frodo is 50.
Mm-hmm.
Bilbo was 50 when he left on his journey.
Right.
And there's this sense that like they're leaving one without Gandalf like they planned. They plan to have Gandalf guiding them and protecting them. So they're going off, they're striking off into the unknown, but they also don't really know what their journey is yet. And Frodo says to Gandalf at the beginning of the chapter, he says something essentially like, like Bilbo like left to find a treasure.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a clear goal at the end of his journey.
Right.
But I'm leaving without knowing what my quest even is.
Yeah.
And I'm going to lose a treasure, not to find it.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, there's a lot of like pluck and bravery and courage that they show just starting before they even know what they're doing. I think you said earlier, they're winging it, and that's exactly what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. We
get a little bit of an insight into like the magic that the hobbits have, which it's not like a powerful magic like wizards or elves, but it says in their dark cloaks they were as invisible as if they all had magic rings. Since they were all hobbits and were trying to be silent, they made no noise that even hobbits would hear. And I think that kind of gets back to something that's introduced in The Hobbit really subtly. But the narrator in The Hobbit essentially says like, hey, why don't you see hobbits anymore? Like, what are these hobbit things? And he implies that hobbits still exist. It's just that we're too busy lumbering about in our like modern way of not paying attention. And so these like small creatures who are silent are able to kind of like go unnoticed by us.
Right.
And so it's kind of like an in-universe reason for why we don't see hobbits anymore. In the same way that the elves going to the West and leaving Middle Earth is kind of like an in-universe explanation for why we don't have elves anymore. Mm-hmm. Hobbits are just kind of like, they're easily unnoticed.
Right.
Both in the world of the text, but also like it's implied in the modern world. Like we don't see them because they don't want to be seen.
Yeah. 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 I like that, and I like that you sort of couch it as magic, because I do think that's actually how magic functions in Tolkien's world. That it's something that is, it's like it invested as a part of the person or the being. It's not like a skill, that you learn necessarily. It's like it's a trait, right? So hobbits have this trait that if they want to be silent, they can be. And even another hobbit couldn't hear them. Even the wild things in the fields and woods hardly notice their passing. Frodo, wonders if he shall ever look down into that valley again.
He's so dramatic.
He's always saying these things out loud to himself. And later on when we find out about the kind of plot that Merry and Pippin and Sam had. They're like, well, you're always muttering to yourself that you might not, right? You might not see the Shire again. We were pretty sure that you were leaving. And
Yeah, you're not as subtle as you thought you were,
yeah,
dude.
exactly. Yeah. So Pippin gets sleepy and wants to stop, and Frodo gives him a hard time. I thought you liked walking in the dark.
Yeah.
But there's no great hurry. They're still kind of lackadaisical about how much time they have and what the
Yeah,
stakes are.
consistently in this chapter they rest and then they eat and then they rest some more.
Yeah,
It's not they're not on a march here. They're just kind of taking their sweet time.
right.
Partly probably hoping that Gandalf will catch up to them.
Show up. Yeah, maybe there's a little bit of prevaricating because they're hoping Gandalf will figure out where they went. And then we have what I think of as a little bit of Narnia. I'm sorry to bring up Clive, but
Oh, C.S. Lewis.
the fox sees them passing through the
Oh,
woods, and
what a weird
then we get
what a
fox
weird little
thoughts.
aside. Yeah, it's I think like people often mention this as like a strange moment in Lord of the
Yeah,
Rings. It doesn't really match the tone of the rest of the story.
yeah,
And I think this is I think this is like an echo of earlier drafts of Lord of the Rings where
yeah,
he's still writing the sequel to The Hobbit.
right,
And in The Hobbit, the narrator has a much more whimsical tone because it's
right,
written for children. And so this definitely is like a leftover bit of that tone
yeah,
that is a little jarring when you're reading it. And you might be like, what? Like, yeah. So it says, a fox passing through the wood on business of his own stopped several minutes and sniffed. Hobbits, he thought. Well, what's next? I have heard of strange doings in this land, but I have seldom heard of a hobbit sleeping out of doors under a tree. 3 of them. There's something mighty queer about this. He was quite right, but he never found out any more about it.
very odd.
I was thinking about it, and it's definitely out of place. And I think if Tolkien had like a more intense editor or had been willing to accept more intense editing, they may have cut that bit out. But it is like right in the midst of like a lot of descriptions of nature
Yeah,
in the area. I mean, he's talking about the flora. He's talking about the resin scented darkness of the trees,
mm-hmm.
and he's describing the great trees' roots that they're curling up in to go to sleep. And so, like, I think it kind of fits in its own way that he's just kind of describing the natural world around the hobbits.
Right.
And so it's not as like out of place as I might have thought in past readings, but it definitely is weird that we get fox thoughts. And I don't think
Yeah.
we get anything like this in the entire rest of the book.
I mean, he certainly read and reread these chapters and just chose to keep it in.
Yeah, he liked it.
He liked it, and it's kind of whimsical. You're sort of like,
Oh, it's full of whimsy. Yeah, you're so right.
we're told that Frodo didn't fear any danger yet,
No.
and so then maybe he kind of delivers us this little bit of whimsy because it's like, you don't need to feel too worried yet either.
No.
We're still in the kind of the more childlike part of this story, at least
That's
for a
right.
couple more pages. And
That's right.
yeah, Fox
So they
thoughts,
wake up, they have breakfast, and
of
they kind
course,
of
very
they kind
important.
of there's this banter between them that I think just shows how, like, what good friends they are.
Yeah,
Frodo and Pippin are like they're on the same level of like their social class, and Sam is definitely still like their servant,
yeah,
and they kind of boss him around a little bit, like telling him to go
yeah.
fetch water and like get breakfast ready for this time, Sam. But their banter is really endearing, and it's very British.
Mm-hmm.
I have some British family members and friends, and just the way they talk to, and if we have any British listeners, excuse our our patronizing tone about the
Yeah,
Brits, but
sorry.
um, you know, the British, they call it taking the piss.
Right.
You know, they just like, they love to rib each other,
Yeah.
you know, and there's lots of just like kind of like back and forth, just kind of cutting each other down a little bit, cutting them down to size.
Yeah.
And that's just, that's it's really endearing about the hobbits, how they talk to each other and their friends.
Yeah. I watch a fair amount of British television, and it definitely reminds me of that kind of repartee
Yeah.
that they have, as well as sort of a self-deprecating. It's
Yeah.
always couched in a way that could be, I think, an American. We have such a flat way of talking to each other. It's all surface level, and
Very,
I
very, very surface level, very,
I
very
think
serious. And we take offense very
I think
easily.
we would take offense to some of the things that they say to each other in friendly ways, on some of these shows, and here too, but it's always couched in a friendly way, and in a way that also includes some self-deprecation. So it's not like coming from a place of, you know, lording it over anyone necessarily.
No, no.
It's about establishing some equality, I think, actually. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. They're good friends. So they, you know, tease each other, you know, that like, you know, Sam, did you get the bath water hot yet? No, no, sir. No, sir. Frodo, where you been? I thought you were going to get water. He's like, oh, I don't keep water in my pockets. You know,
he
like there's
just
this,
he just walks off to the edge of the wood. It says he's
yeah,
like
just
daydreaming or something.
taking his dang time. But I mean,
Yeah,
I think that just kind of speaks. He's used to people kind of waiting on him. He's not a working class hobbit. He's
no,
not usually, he's kind of soft and flabby, and he doesn't have to do an honest day's work for his entire life up to this point. And,
yeah,
uh, but yeah, you know, they get to marching, and pretty quickly Pippin starts complaining about how far they have to walk,
right.
even though he knows exactly how far they have to walk. And he says, the road goes on forever, but I can't without a rest. It's
Mm-hmm.
high time for lunch. So yeah, lots of eating, lots of taking your time. But that the road goes on forever, that really sets up this famous poem,
Right.
which I think is worth reading the whole poem. You want to read that one?
Yeah, sure. They're gazing eastwards along the road, which is the direction they're headed. And then, yeah, perhaps what Pippin says unlocks this in his mind. Suddenly he spoke, aloud, but as if to himself, saying slowly, "The road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road has gone, and I must follow, if I can, pursuing it with wary feet, until it joins some larger way, where many paths and errands meet, and whither then I cannot say." Pippin immediately says, "Well, that sounds like Bilbo's rhyming."
Yeah,
And
and we get a version of this poem from Bilbo's lips,
right,
with a minor alteration,
yeah,
which I think is worth mentioning. You know, Frodo says, "Pursuing it with weary feet
mm,
until it joins some larger way," and Bilbo says, on the kind of outset of his journey, he says, "Pursuing it with eager feet
right,
until it joins some larger way."
yeah,
And so there's definitely, like, you know, Bilbo left having unburdened himself and going off to this new stage of his life. Frodo is leaving with this huge burden, and he's
yeah,
already wearied by it. And this is not what he chose for himself,
right,
but he's doing it anyway. But I think it's interesting that, like, Frodo is like, you know, I don't really know if I wrote that, or if I just vaguely remember it from,
yeah. Where
uh,
did I hear that? You know?
yeah, or did I make it up myself? You know, Pippin's like,
Mm-hmm.
that sounds like one of old Bilbo's rhymes, or is it one of your imitations? And
Mm,
uh, there's this theme, this like kind of recurring event that happens where uh, characters who are like in, you know, situations beyond their capabilities speak with a voice that's not their own.
mm-hmm.
You know, Sam and Frodo. There's a few times when Sam and Frodo are, you know, in Mordor when they start speaking in Elvish, and it's not
Yeah.
clear where it comes from, and they don't even necessarily even understand the words, but it's almost like given to them as like a spiritual,
Inspired. Yeah.
um, yeah, it's like a spiritual bolstering of themselves. And so this seems to be kind of a version of that. It's almost like Frodo's given these words to speak, and they're almost like a prayer
Yeah.
to inspire him. And it's a beautiful sentiment, and it's it's a theme that is really throughout Tolkien, that roads, journeys, quests are like a river that can sweep you off your feet
Hmm.
and take you to places that you never expected to go, and that it's dangerous to step outside your door because you never know where you might end up.
Yeah. I think it's worth reading also what Frodo says, in response to to Pippin asking, is that one of Bilbo's rhymes? And he says, it reminds me of Bilbo in the last years before he went away. He used to often say there was only one road, that it was like a great river. Its springs were at every doorstep, and every path was its tributary. It's a dangerous business, Frodo, going out your door, he used to say. You step into the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept off to. Do you
That's
realize
right.
that this is the very path that goes through Mirkwood, and that if you let it, it might take you to the Lonely Mountain, or even further into worse places? Yeah, worse places, no kidding. Um,
Yeah, yeah, they're going
it,
to a little bit of a worse place now.
it's
Yeah,
a very spiritual orientation toward the world and the connection right between things, that Bilbo would see literally the path up to his door as a path into the entire world, like everything being connected. That there's one road,
yeah,
is a beautiful sentiment, and also kind of overwhelming, especially for a hobbit.
yeah. It's
Um,
dangerous.
yeah, dangerous, and
We already said they don't like rivers.
yeah,
They don't like the idea of being swept away.
they don't like being swept away. They're little creatures close to the ground with big feet, and they want to feel like they're on solid ground. But
Yeah,
once you
yeah.
step out your door, the ground is less solid than maybe you think. So, um,
And speaking of, I mean, right at this moment, they hear something coming towards them,
yeah,
and that's when they encounter for the second time now, uh, in a more up close and personal way, this pony or horse
yeah,
coming on the road up to them, and they wonder, like, I wonder if this is Gandalf coming up. Like, let's hide, and we'll give him a good surprise.
hmm
We'll pay him back for being late, and so they hide.
and Frodo
Thank
has
God.
Frodo has some um, instinct or something. He says he has a sudden unreasoning fear of discovery. So they get
That's
off
right.
the road quick because he's like, if it is Gandalf, we'll surprise him, and if not, then we'll be safe.
Right.
But yeah, good thing that they get off the road when they do.
Yeah, it says Frodo hesitated for a second. Curiosity or some other feeling was struggling with his desire to hide. The sound of hooves drew nearer. Just in time, he threw himself down in a patch of long grass behind a tree that overshadowed the road. Then he lifted his head and peered cautiously above one of the great roots.
Hmm.
Round the corner came a black horse, no hobbit pony, but a full-sized horse, and on it sat a large man who seemed to crouch in the saddle, wrapped in a great black cloak and hood, so that only his boots and the high stirrup shadowed below. His face was shadowed and invisible. I wonder if that's maybe because he has no face at all.
Yeah, exactly. His face is shadow.
Yeah,
Um, yeah,
yeah, yeah. But then we get this really eerie desire that anytime the
mhm,
Black Rider comes near Frodo, he suddenly like has this desire to put on the ring.
right. He's compelled to look. He's always compelled to look. He doesn't just hide. He sort of crawls back to the edge of the road, and then yeah, this desire to put the ring on, also to protect himself maybe, but also maybe the ring is trying to reveal itself.
And it says, a sudden unreasoning fear of discovery laid hold of Frodo, and he thought of his ring.
Mm.
He hardly dared to breathe, and yet the desire to get it out of his pocket became so strong that he began slowly to move his hand.
Mm-hmm.
The advice of Gandalf seemed absurd. Bilbo had used the ring, and I'm still in the Shire, he thought, as his hand touched the chain on which it hung. So there's this sense that like the spiritual evil power of the Nazgul can kind of like tell you what you want to hear in a way that serves them the best, where it sounds reasonable to say, oh yeah, I can put this ring on. I know Gandalf told me not to, but he would understand, you know?
Yeah.
Right. And that is what makes this so dangerous, because of course, if you put the ring on, it would be like a beacon to the Black Rider, and you'd see him right away. But just in that moment, the rider goes away out of sight.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the hobbits just sort of pass it off as queer and disturbing.
No, that was weird.
It wasn't an existential threat, right? It was just really odd. I mean, who's ever seen something like that?
Like, was he sniffing? What a weird,
very strange. Or was it the horse that was sniffing? Yeah, it's
they don't like the sniffing going on, and
they try to dismiss it as there being some men about. And then Sam says, "I know where he came from. He came from Hobbiton because he talked to the Gaffer." And
Frodo gives him a hard time for this, but
yeah,
Frodo heard this conversation too. I don't know why he's so shocked by Sam's revelation that he heard, the Black Rider talking to the Gaffer. But we get a little bit of like,
I think
more
he's just
insight
scared.
Into. Yeah, I think
scared. He's like, "Why didn't you say something about it?" And he's like, "Well, he can't be blamed anyway. I heard the conversation too."
Right.
And he was actually too afraid to go up the road to see who it was. And they just wish that they had Gandalf with them, which I think is a really effective way to tell the story that the hobbits are pretty alone, even in the Shire. That it really would be better if Gandalf was there with them.
But there's also this realization that if they had waited for Gandalf, things would have been much worse.
Right.
They kind of got away right in the nick of time.
That's
if
true.
If they had waited, then they would have been discovered.
Yeah, the timing really works out well.
Yeah, and that's another theme that kind of works its way through the text over and over and over again is, things working out in the exact way for the quest to be successful.
Right.
There's a luck that the good characters enjoy, even when everything feels like everything is going completely wrong.
Right.
You find out with time as the story unfolds that if they had gone the way that they'd hoped, or if things had shaken out the way that they had wanted it to, that it would have been disastrous. That what seemed like a disastrous turn of luck was actually exactly what needed to happen for them to be successful. Right. And that just happens over and over and over again. It's like, I mean, it's terrible that Gandalf's not here, but if they had waited for Gandalf, they would have been discovered. So they move along, and in true Hobbit fashion, rather than get down in the dumps, they sing a silly little song.
Right.
And it seems like, this is why the hobbits are so resistant to the power of the Nazgul, I think, is that, how do you combat an evil that sucks away your courage and your hope? You sing,
light a fire. Before they sing, and maybe they're sort of inspired to sing by the star that comes out of the trees in the darkening east before them. I can't remember the name of the star that this might be. It's probably Venus, right?
It'd be Venus, yeah, the star of Arendelle.
Yeah, I think it doesn't say that's what it is, but I think that's implied.
That's a great catch, and I have it highlighted here.
It's at dusk when it comes out of the trees, and that's when Venus would appear. Right.
A star came out above the trees in the darkening east before them. They went abreast in step to keep up their spirits. Yeah, and for folks who haven't read the Silmarillion, which is most people, this star is like super important. I won't get too deep into the weeds because I don't want to bore people to death, but this star is one of the Silmarils that is being held in the sky by this character named Earendel, who is Elrond's father. And his job is essentially to watch over Middle Earth and prevent the first Dark Lord, Sauron's boss, Melkor, from coming back.
Melkor.
And it's a beloved star because it holds the light of the two trees of Valinor.
Right.
And it's the last of the Silmarils, and it is always in the sky above. And it's the light that's in the phial of Galadriel.
Mm-hmm.
It's a light that encourages and gives people hope. And so, yeah, that's a great catch. You know, that's a really important thing.
It shows up several times in moments like these where, you know, they need a little encouragement or some connection to this, you know, this greater power. It will sort of show up in the sky. So
there's a sense that like the celestial bodies, the stars, are a reminder that there is good that's greater than any evil on earth could ever extinguish.
Right. Yeah.
And you know, as bad as things might be here below, the evil here can't touch that beauty. Yeah. There's light and high beauty that evil can't touch. And you know, we'll see it over and over and over again that this star in particular encourages and gives hope. And you know, eventually when they link up with Strider in a few chapters, and they're also being pursued by the same enemy, to encourage the hobbits when they're at their lowest point, he sings them the song of Beren and Luthien.
Yeah.
Which, if you're just reading Lord of the Rings, you've not read the Silmarillion, it might be kind of lost as to the significance of this. But the story of Beren and Luthien is the story of a mortal man stealing a Silmaril from Morgoth, Sauron's boss, the Dark Lord. And that's the very Silmaril that they're looking at right now in the sky, Venus.
Yeah.
And so it seems like the way that you combat this particular brand of evil is through singing songs that encourage you and remind you that there's good, and that there's these, like, you know, in the Hobbits case here, the song they sing is very common.
Yeah.
It's about simple pleasures.
It's interesting that it's as night falls, as the stars grew thicker and brighter, the feeling of disquiet left them, and they no longer listened for the sounds of hooves. They kind of forget that, you know, this scary thing is out there. They begin to hum, and then they get into this pretty common song, a walking song. And they leave out any of the mentions of supper in bed because they don't want to be reminded that they're hungry and tired, I think, which is really cute. Like, they sort of decide together that they're not going. And Bilbo had made the words to a tune that was as old as the hills, almost like a hymn, right? All those hymns are based on tunes that people already knew. Folk songs, and I would say, you know, I would draw a connection with the idea of particularly the stars that we now understand are planets, but the stars in general and the heavens. When ancient people talk about heaven, like, we think of it as like a metaphysical place that whatever your soul lives or something.
The place you go when you die.
But when they talk about the heaven and they talk about the perfection of heaven, it's because they literally look up at the stars every night, and they're the same every night, every week, every month, every year. You can track the course of, you know, Venus across the sky. And so there is a sense that, like, the heavens, the mechanical nature of the heavens, the perfection of that is comforting or is somehow ideal. And so I think that's what's happening here in a way, that even as the stars come out, and then of course we'll have the connection to the elves here in a minute, but even as the stars come out and the night starts to draw around them, they feel encouraged in order to sing and to encourage each other through song as well. So
Yeah.
one thing kind of reflects the other, I think.
Absolutely. Then Pippin gets a little too into it, and he sings the last words
Now
in
to bed.
a high voice. And now to bed, and now to bed. And then Frodo says, "Hush."
Yeah.
They hear hoofs again, and they decide that they need to hide. Pippin very helpfully says, "Don't forget about the sniffing."
Yes.
And they go and they hide uh, off the path again, and Frodo hears the sound of snuffling, and then he sees this horrifying image. The shadow bent to the ground and then began to crawl towards them. Once more, the desire to slip on the ring came over Frodo, but this time it was stronger than before. So strong that almost before he realized what he was doing, his hand was groping in his pocket. But in that moment, there came a sound like mingled song and laughter. Clear voices rose and fell in the starlit air, and the Black Rider retreats.
Mm-hmm.
And to Sam's great delight, we get some elves.
Yeah. Yes, it is elves, said Frodo. And they're just sort of dumbstruck for a
Yeah,
moment
yeah.
as they watch, this company walk by, and
And they're singing their own hymn.
and elves are singing too about the White Queen.
Yeah, Snow White, O Lady Clear, O Queen beyond the western seas, Gilthoniel, O Elbreth. So this is some more like Tolkien legendarium stuff. And I think it's important to remember that for someone who's reading this in 1954, they have no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah.
We have like the internet to Google when we come across weird names in Lord of the Rings. And, if you're like really into Tolkien, you can read the Silmarillion.
Right.
But for someone in 1954, this is all new information. But Elbereth is the Queen of the Valar, is the Elvish name for the Queen of the Valar. So this is a godlike power who lives in Valinor across the seas, and the elves would have interacted with these divine powers before they moved back to Middle Earth, and they remember, that time when they were sort of bathed in the light of these divine powers, and they pray to her. And I think it's interesting that the elves' goodness, and they're singing a hymn to Elbereth. It scares away the Black Rider. Like the Black Rider can't abide in the same place as someone as holy and as good as the elves.
Right.
And I think it's so interesting that it's song and cheer and praise and light and beauty. That's how you fight these creatures. It's not with swords.
Right.
It's with courage and hope and goodness. And it saves their bacon, man. Like they were within inches of being overtaken by this Black Rider, but the elves, by some turn of fate, the elves show up in exactly the right place at the right time. And you have to get a sense that the elf who we learned is Gildor in a minute will say, like, okay, something greater is kind of like pulling the strings here. This isn't an accident that we happened on each other in the woods at the exact same moment. There are powers greater than us that are at work here. And so we need to be thankful for that.
And he's very unwilling to sort of step in and potentially, divert or meddle in the sort of flow of that they're in, right? That the hobbits are in, even though Frodo asks for advice and knowledge and things like that. And Gildor's like, I don't want to get too involved because I don't want to be the person who, who stands in the way of the arc of this narrative that you're part of.
Yeah, it's
And
above his pay grade.
Yeah, exactly.
Even though he's like good and powerful and ancient, it's. I remember like reading this when I was a kid and wondering like, why doesn't Gildor just like
take him to Rivendell?
Take them, yeah,
yeah.
Like, but there's this like trust. There's this like, you've been entrusted with this journey. I don't know exactly what your quest is, and I'm not going to comment on it because it's outside of my complete understanding. So I'm not going to give you advice. Just the only advice that he gives him is to take his friends with him.
Yeah.
Don't go alone. That's his only advice. And he's like, Gandalf wouldn't want you to go alone. So like stick with your friends. And of course we know, and I don't think we've like really talked about this, like Frodo is kind of lying to everybody but Sam and his friends. And he's kind of like hoping that they fall for the same story that he's telling everybody else in Hobbiton, which is that he's just going to go live in Buckland. Right. But, Pippin and Merry are too wise for that. They're never going to let Frodo go off on his own. They don't understand exactly what his quest is, but they know that something is up, and they're never going to abandon their friend. Yeah. So I think it's interesting that Gildor gives them this exact same advice.
Right. They have no intention of staying. Even though I think Frodo would probably like try to give them the slip, right? And maybe even Sam, Yeah, so they see the elves singing. The elves notice. They do notice, and they know it's Frodo. Hail, Frodo.
Yeah, they say, "Hail, Frodo." Yeah, and Frodo's kind of taken aback by the fact they, like, how do you know who I am? And they're essentially like, hey, just because you haven't seen us doesn't mean we haven't seen you.
Yeah, right. And maybe the hobbits aren't trying to be too sneaky right here. They're just sort of, dumbfounded by this passage of the elves. And Frodo gives Gildor a sort of a special greeting here.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about this because I just love this. So they invite the hobbits to come with them for the night and to lodge with them and eat with them, which I'm sure the hobbits are thrilled at the prospect of having.
Absolutely.
Good elf food. But Frodo bows and says, Ellen Sila Luminen Omen Tielvo. A star shines in the hour of our meeting. And the elves are taken aback, and Gildor laughs at this. It's kind of almost like you imagine like hearing a little kid say like a really like polite greeting, and everybody kind of laughs at it. But he says, speak no secrets. Here is a scholar in the ancient tongue. Bilbo was a good master. Hail, elf friend, he said, bowing to Frodo.
That's a big deal, being called an elf friend.
Yeah. It's like a title.
Pretty rare. And I love the speak no secrets. Here's a scholar in the ancient tongue. It's so sweet. Like, you're not going to be able to get away with just speaking in Elvish because Frodo might suss it out,
Yeah, I know we were about to talk a bunch of crap about these little guys. Careful, because
careful.
One of them kind of understands what we're saying a little bit, even though he says it funny.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
But a little like Tolkien fun fact is that in the letters, somebody wrote him a fan letter and asked him like essentially like why in the world did you write this thing? Like what inspired you to write it? And Tolkien kind of jokingly said that he wanted to create a world where it would be reasonable for one person to greet another by saying, a star shines in the hour of our meeting.
What?
So he had written the Elvish line.
Yeah.
Ellen Silla Luminen Omen Tielvo. Sorry to anybody who's like really, really into Elvish who wants to like pick apart my pronunciation of that.
Send us in a recording if you're offended by. Yeah.
Yeah, if you can do it better, send it
Right.
in. But I probably said it just about as good as Frodo did. But he had that bit of Elvish written out, and he thought it was a beautiful string of words in this
Mm-hmm.
invented language that he made. And so he kind of like, he says he built the world around this particular greeting. And that's how Tolkien's mind worked. You know, he had all these languages that he had written, and he knew that there's no language that exists without history,
Right.
that like language comes out of the human experience. And so language is colored by the experiences of a people, and that's how languages come to be. And so he started with the languages, and he's like, "What? How could I color a world where these languages make sense?" And that's what we get with his Legendarium.
Very cool. What a great detail. How wonderful that he answered those letters too, you know.
Oh,
Um,
it's such a gift. You know, if you have a few months to spare, going through and really diving into those letters is a real treat. He answered them at length. So the elves very graciously, and probably recognizing that the hobbits are in trouble, invite them to come and eat and sleep in the same place as them that night. And so they march for a long time, but then they get to this forest dwelling that is very you know, to the hobbit's eyes, very magical. Um, it's ironic that the elves invite them to do this, because in the Hobbit, when the dwarves are in the forest and they're starving and lost, they try to seek kind of a similar hospitality from the elves, and they're imprisoned for it. So
mhm.
this is clearly like a very exceptional moment. This isn't something that happens very often,
Mhm.
and the hobbits just eat it up. I mean, they have great food and drink that's good enough for a birthday party. Bilbo or Frodo says,
Yeah, right.
um, and Sam for years after talks about it to anybody that will listen, and says, "If I could grow apples like that, I'd call myself a gardener."
That's so good.
Um, and then they just kind of lull off to sleep. You know,
Mhm.
Sam is curled up at Frodo's feet, and Pippin is snoring off somewhere. But Gildor and Frodo stay up late into the night, talking about, you know, everything that's transpiring and how strange it is. So, and then Gildor says to Frodo, he says, "You do not ask me or tell me much that concerns yourself, Frodo, but I already know a little, and I can read more in your face and in the thought behind your questions. You are leaving the Shire, and yet you doubt that you will find what you seek, or accomplish what you intend to, or that you will ever return. Is that not so?" And Frodo is shocked by this insight that Gildor has,
Mhm.
and Gildor, you know, says essentially that the secret that Frodo has will not reach the enemy. And Frodo's like, "The enemy? How do you know about the enemy?" And he says, "I do
Mhm.
not know for what reason the enemy is pursuing you, but I perceive that he is, strange indeed though it seems to me. And I warn you that peril is now before you and behind you and upon either side."
Yeah, and Frodo says, "You mean the riders? I fear that they were servants of the enemy. What are the Black Riders?" And Gilder's kind of appalled. He's like, "Hasn't Gandalf told you anything?"
Yeah,
Nothing
not
about such
much.
creatures. They go back and forth, and Gilder says the Shire is not a protection to you. Like, you're in danger. Just because you're
Yeah,
in the heart of the Shire doesn't mean that you shouldn't be afraid. Um,
yeah, and that's
and
the bit that we started with, the selection that we started
yeah,
the pod with today. Um, you know, Gilder reminds Frodo that just because they're in the Shire, you know, they should still be very careful, because they don't understand how terrifying this enemy is. And
right.
Gildor is like, you know, if I were to tell you like who these guys are, I think it would terrify you to the point of paralyzing you essentially. So I'm just not going to tell you, uh, you know, who they are, but you should know that just because this is your home doesn't mean that you're safe. In fact, you know, the Shire is not yours. You know, there were
Hmm.
others who dwelt in the Shire before you. and there will be others who dwell in the Shire long after you're gone.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, the wide world is all about you. You can fence yourselves in, but you cannot forever fence it out.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just that reminder that, the hobbits have lived this blessed existence. And we find out later that it's because of the forces of more powerful, more wise beings that they're allowed to exist in this kind of protected state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they kind of get into Frodo's plan, and I think Gildor encourages him. He said, "I think this is a plan you should stick to."
Yeah.
And you should ask Gandalf when you see him. Like he will give you clearer counsel. But of course Frodo says, "Well, I've been expecting Gandalf and he's not coming around. I don't know what have happened. Should I wait for him?" Gildor doesn't like the news that Gandalf should be late. It's not a good tiding. But he says, this is worth reading, I think, here. He says, "But it is said, do not meddle in the affairs of wizards, for they are subtle and quick to anger. The choice is yours, to go or to wait." And then Frodo says, "And it's also said," answered Frodo, "go not to the elves for counsel, for they will say both no and yes."
What a sick burn.
And Gildor laughs. Elves seldom give unguarded advice, for advice is a dangerous gift, even from the wise to the wise, and all courses may run ill. But that whole exchange, I mean, do not meddle in the affairs of wizards feels like something that somebody wrote down 5,000 years ago.
Yeah, it's folk wisdom.
And go not to the elves for counsel, for they will say both no and yes, also feels that way.
Yeah,
And
and that's
I
what
think,
gives this story so much depth.
I think
this sense of like,
I think you could go to somebody who's never read The Lord of the Rings or seen the movies and say, "Do not meddle in the affairs of wizards, for they are subtle and quick to anger." And they'd be like, "Yeah, that's true. This is common sense." That's how deeply
a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush.
Right. Like that's how deeply this stuff has wormed its way into culture. It's like at the heart of who we understand ourselves to be. Even though I don't think we could really what does that mean? Don't, meddle in the affairs of wizards. We could go on and on about that, but people basically see this as common sense. And don't go to the elves for counsel, for they will say both no and yes. So I love that kind of back and forth right there. But then we get the piece again. I think it bears repeating that Gildor's basic advice is this: do not go alone. Take such friends as are trusty and willing. Now you should be grateful, for I do not give this counsel gladly. The elves have their own labors and their own sorrows, and they are little concerned with the ways of hobbits or of any other creature upon the earth. In this meeting there may be more than chance, but the purpose is not clear to me, and I fear to say too much. So because he's worried about the sort of auspicious nature of their meeting, he doesn't want to get in the way of that, but he is willing to give some wisdom, which is take your friends with you. So that you have somebody to sing with, so that you have somebody to light a fire with, that's going to protect
keep your courage.
That's going to protect you even more than Gandalf could.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful thing. That's a piece of this text that we should take into our lives and cherish your friends and spend time as much as you can, making new friends and gathering people around you, because that's what makes life worthwhile.
Yeah. Don't go it alone.
Right.
And Frodo very tenderly asks Gildor, "Where shall I find courage? That is what I chiefly need." And Gildor responds, "Courage is found in unlikely places. Be of good hope. Sleep now. In the morning we shall have gone, but we will send our through the lands. I name you elf friend. and may the stars shine upon the end of your road.
Mm.
And that's how he leaves them, and they go off in safety to sleep, and that's how the chapter ends.
Yeah. Beautiful. What a great meeting with Gildor and this little band of elves. I remember the first time I read this, I was like sort of baffled by this whole aside, and just thought, like, what is going on here? Like what?
Let's get the story going. What are they doing?
Yeah. But as an adult, I crave this kind of a meeting. I crave those points in my life where I can kind of turn aside from, marching out of the Shire or whatever, and just be listened to and taken care of by people who are, older and wiser and more, I don't know, self-assured or something than I am. And so I really find a lot of comfort in these few pages.
And what great advice. Take your friends with you.
Absolutely. Do not go alone. Beautiful.
That was a fun reading, man. And can't wait to pick it up next week for A Shortcut to Mushrooms, where the hobbits get into all kinds of new shenanigans.
Absolutely. Some more humor and more hobbit culture coming at us.
That's right.
Thanks for reading along with us. Join us next week for Chapter 4, A Shortcut to Mushrooms. If you want to help us out, share this podcast with a Lord of the Rings fan in your life. Follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and visit waywardwizards.com for more info. May the hair on your toes never fall out. We'll see you next week.